Anthony, thank you so much for joining us here at FundForum International 2017.
Good to be here.
Great. We heard there in the panel a description of the global economy at the moment as being somewhat of a dichotomy. Can you describe what that means for me and what was meant by that?
Well, there's this VIX volatility index, which is basically trading of options, S&P forward options, and it's at a 23-year low. It's considered by many as the fear factor, which gauges market investors' fears about volatility and risk. It is at a low, which indicates that many people are considering geopolitical risk to be of low probability. There are a lot of the risks you and I can come up with, a long list of things, both Europe and globally. But in terms of the dichotomy that you just mentioned, and I mentioned, companies are looking at the world a little bit differently. McKinsey just came up with wrote an interesting report indicating that companies in Europe and elsewhere are hoarding cash. And they are being very careful about the investments they're making. So investments as a percentage of GDP is actually low, very low. So they are clearly worried about risks they need to protect against of many different types, whether it's terrorism or uncontrolled immigration, or even in the Middle East, North Korea, North Africa, and so on. So it is a very different picture, and individuals, interestingly, even in Germany, where the economy is doing so well, unemployment is so low, are fearful about the future. They're fearful about loss of control, which is similar in the United States, similar to in the UK that led to Brexit. So there is fear, and yet stock market investors believe that there are very good tailwinds. A lot of conditions are now very positive. Consumer confidence is back. A lot of good things are happening. So you're right, it's a picture of a tale of two cities.
And what do you think are the causes of that caution and fear at the heart of it? Obviously, fear of sort of global terrorism or a proliferation of nuclear weapons. Those are issues that have been raised. Are these big geopolitical issues really at the heart of what the basic investor is fearful of?
I think so. I think investors may look at each of those risks separately and conclude that they are low probability events. The trouble is that there are a lot of those risks, and they're very interconnected risks. And some of them are rather existential risks in terms of Europe and the construction of the European project. So they're considering them to be low probability events. But I would just say this, a lot of the risks have been managed, but they haven't been solved. That's the main point. Whether it's Ukraine, whether it's the Balkans, or the Middle East, or the Shia Suuni conflict, which is now appears to be coming back in full force, or North Korea, or many other issues that we can think of. So I would just be very cautious. My personal view is that we may be underestimating the tail risk of these events occurring.
So if that's the case, what is there to be optimistic about in terms of investing potential, and how should investors be reacting to an environment and a landscape like this?
That's a very, very tough question, because the change in Trump administration also poses some risks to Europe and has been identified as such by both Chancellor Merkel and by other members of the EU, and I think probably appropriately so. But look, 4 years is a short period of time. Companies are clearly not going to be making massive changes in their investment strategy or in their footprint of where they place factories and so on. But it could be 8 years, in which case I think we would be in a different world, because some of the things that Europe relied on for a stable context in which to invest may no longer be there. The United States has always been there as the guarantor of European peace and stability, the guarantor of this multilateral rules-based trading system, and appears to be stepping back from that now. So what do companies do about this? Not so easy, but certainly in trade relations, I think that there could be some changes coming up sooner rather than later. We've already seen some indication of this administration being willing to take out of the toolbox certain laws that have been applied in the past, to be fair, that will allow this administration to apply unilateral trade restrictive measures for a variety of reasons, including national security at a time of peace, which is what's so remarkable, at a time of peace to invoke national security. If we go down this road of unilateral trade restrictive measures and ignoring the WTO and the institutions we built up, and even worse, ignoring decisions of the WTO that go against us, That could have an impact on trade restrictions and frictions, creation of frictions, and on supply chains, to be more practical. So companies that are relying on complex, lengthy supply chains need to think very carefully about diversification and reducing their risk exposure.
So you truly believe that the absolute heart of the relationship between the US and Europe is shifting significantly? Because for so many years there's been this at least philosophical sort of union, if you like, even if there wasn't necessarily a trade one.
Well, there will always be a certain degree of stability here because of our trade flows. Our investment across border was mentioned in our session, are large. We're our largest trading partners. Those things aren't going to go away. Our business community understands it, gets it, how important it is for Europe to remain integrated, unified as an area of prosperous democratic societies. That's not going to go away. And I also note happily that the rhetoric of this administration has improved over the last month, let's say. Now we're saying we're clearly in favor of NATO, we're in favor of the EU, we want to partner and engage with both institutions. That's all to the good. But if you consider what's behind the rhetoric, something different has now occurred. And what's different now is this administration no longer looks with favor at the multilateral rules-based order. No longer looks with favor at a regional economic grouping like the EU. It clearly has said, we want to deal country to country, bilaterally, transactionally, so deal by deal, with individual countries, and we want to strike good bargains. And clearly the rhetoric has been every deal we've ever done in the past has been a bad deal. We've not negotiated properly. This is very, very different. This is very different from anything we've seen in the past. And I would go so far to say, maybe a bit provocative, if you close your eyes and you listen to what this administration is saying, it's very close to what Vladimir Putin is saying. He's basically arguing that the system that's been built up by the West or by democracies has injured our interests. And Trump is basically saying the same thing, that we have been ripped off and we need to change the system. We're almost becoming a revisionist power. Some may be a bit exaggerated, but there's a lot of truth in it.
So where does this leave the UK in terms of Brexit? They may not be part of an EU anyway. So does that improve the likelihood of a bilateral agreement, say, with the US, because they won't be part of a bloc?
Well, there were high hopes expressed, right, that the UK was going to be able to quickly strike a deal with the United States, and then reality quickly imposed itself, because then people explained to both the Prime Minister and to our President that it ain't so easy. First, the UK needs to exit the EU before they even start negotiating with the United States. And not only that, it will take years to strike a free trade deal. Just look at our past. I actually looked at the figures, how long it takes us to strike free trade agreements. Even with the relatively simple ones with Australia, it took, I think, about 13 months. With the UK, it probably would be even more complicated because it's a much larger economy. So you're looking at another 15 months before Brexit occurs, and then it'll take another probably 2 years, a year and a half at minimum. You're talking about a long period of time, and that takes you to the end of the Trump administration. So there are no quick fixes. The second thing is that the Prime Minister in the UK, Theresa May, has realized that Donald Trump is not an easy partner to deal with. The thought was, well, I'm going to invoke the special relationship at a time of my negotiation with a very tough EU, and that will give me some negotiating leverage. And I think the reality has set in that this is not an easy administration to deal with. We saw the frictions about the leaks after the terrorist attacks in the UK. We saw frictions about very different positions expressed in Washington compared to London, about core issues like free trade, about open borders, about tolerance to immigrants and so on. These are very, very different views. So I think the government in London has, I think, appropriately realized that, well, of course they need to deal with any U.S. administration, including this one. Absolutely, it's important. But it's not quite as easy as they thought.
So what's the way forward now? What is there to be optimistic about, big picture-wise? What do you see as the next chapter, if you like?
Well, look, the news in Europe, and certainly continental Europe, I think is quite good. Who would have thought, even 12 months ago, that confidence would have returned so quickly? That all of the 27 EU countries are now growing, which is big news, including Greece, including Italy. Right, it's anemic growth, but everyone is growing. confidence has returned, business confidence has returned. People are now beginning to invest again. And more generally, politically, the EU is now beginning to think of its future as 27 rather than 28. 12 months ago, there was a real sense of desperation because the image, the project had been sunk below the waterline, or the concern was that it was really an existential threat. That's no longer the case. So economic growth is back, confidence is back, and general conditions globally, I think, are favorable, but with the geopolitical risk we're talking about. So on the whole, there is quite a bit to be confident about. The risks, things could have been worse. Things could have been a lot worse. Some of those risks could have gone badly wrong, and so far I think the EU and the member states have managed them pretty well.
Anthony, thank you so much for sharing your insights. It's been fascinating.
Thank you very much.